Series. As most of you know, June is Forage Month in Alabama and across the U.S. And so we're doing this series to just raise awareness and help educate the public about the role of forages in society, especially as it relates to dairy and meat consumption. So if you haven't tuned in to our other webinars yet, you can go back and view the archives from earlier this month. And also we have a few more coming up during the last couple of weeks of June. So we'd encourage you to tune into those and learn more about forage management as it relates to various aspects of livestock production as well as conserved forage production. Today I'm going to be talking with us more specifically about baleage and silage production in the Southeast. And so baleage production is really something that's increased in interest over the last several years in the Southeast, and we've seen more adoption of the use of this technology, whereas silage production is something that's maybe more traditionally been used largely in our dairy systems in the region. But today we're going to really just talk about some quick facts and some production tips for each of these different conserved forage methods. So our goals for today are first to think about baleage and silage production and how they might meet a forage production gap on our operation, especially from a nutritional standpoint when it comes to livestock management. And then also to discuss what are potential uses for these technologies in our farm and what are some emerging technologies or trends that we have seen with each of these different aspects of those production systems. So to start out, I wanted to talk about baleage production first. And for those of you who aren't familiar, first I just wanted to highlight what is the difference between hay versus baleage production. So hay production is probably something that we're more familiar with in our region of the U.S., where we're essentially going in and harvesting that forage, letting it wilt to 10 to 15% moisture before baling, and then using that stored forage commonly during the winter months to feed our livestock during a time when we traditionally have a forage production gap. So commonly in kind of the southern part of Alabama, our forages that we would use for that is Bahia grass and Bermuda grass, whereas more in the northern part of the state, we might be also including tall fescue and even some of our annual cool season forages into that as well. So traditionally, when we think about our overall hay quality in the region, we can characterize that generally as low to mid in quality. And that's generally because of the environmental conditions that we experience, especially during the summer months, where we're challenged by very frequent rainfall conditions that may limit our ability to harvest that forage on a timely basis. So that is the reason that we wanted to talk about baleage production, and that baleage may be able to provide some advantages to our system relative to hay production, mainly from the standpoint that it helps us kind of meter against some of those environmental conditions that we might experience. So baleage production is the process where we're harvesting that forage, but we're only allowing it to wilt to a 40 to 60% moisture range before we bale that forage. And then it is wrapped or ensiled for use at a later time. So it's kind of like a cross then between hay and silage production in this system. Okay, so this can provide us very high quality forage, again, if we harvest that forage at the right stage of maturity. And because there's oftentimes reduced time in the field for this process, it kind of speeds up the process relative to hay production. So moving on to talk more specifically about baleage, what are some of the questions that we get most often about baleage production in the region? One of those is, what are the appropriate forage species that I should be using for baleage production? And so this figure really just shows us, like, kind of in order, what would be how we would prioritize those forages that we would use for that system. So we kind of have our first tier and our second tier of desirable forage crops. The first being our annual systems. And in general, we think about using annuals for baleage production first, largely because they tend to be slightly greater in quality than what our traditional perennial systems can provide us in the Southeast region. So specifically, cool season annuals are an especially good fit for this system. One reason for that is because generally those forages are ready to harvest in the spring of the year. And if you're from the Southeast, you know that spring is typically a very rainy time period. So if you've ever tried to make hay from cool season annuals, it can be very challenging. However, baleage, again, is a system that may allow us to get that forage out of the field more quickly and conserve a very high quality forage product that we can then use later in the production season for feeding our livestock. So our annual forages also tend to be a little bit higher in terms of their carbohydrate storage capacity that provides good fermentation products for the ensiling process. So more specifically about annual forages first and then perennial forages second, we mentioned that really these are the three key points to why we first consider annuals over perennials in this system. So high quality with proper management, mid to high levels of those soluble carbohydrates, which are very important for the fermentation process with baleage production. And that really is what drives us to have a high quality forage product that we can use later on. So this isn't to say that we can't use perennial forages, we certainly can, but we have to be cognizant about their stage of maturity at harvest to make sure that we're getting a high quality product. And so this figure really illustrates that concept a little bit better in terms of what is the appropriate stage of maturity where we should be harvesting these forage crops. And so if we look at some of our perennial forages in this system, really oftentimes we're looking at kind of that 4 to 6 week regrowth interval after that first harvest for things like Bermuda grass and Bahia grass. And then for tall fescue, we're looking at trying to harvest that in the vegetative to boot stage of production. So what does that mean? If we look over here at this figure, really that means we're going to be harvesting our forage. We can see when it's still very leafy. We don't have a lot of very thick stem production, and it's prior to that forage moving into the seed head production or reproductive phase. Okay, so there's kind of a compromise here, and that as our yield increases with increasing maturity, our quality is decreasing. So the reason we're harvesting that forage then in that boot or kind of heading stage of production, we can see we're right at the point where we're still getting good quality for that forage without having a very large compromise in yield at that time as well. So we're really kind of shooting for the midpoint then when we're looking at these particular harvest frequencies. For annual ryegrass, this is when we're looking at what we would call the flag leaf stage. And so you might hear people refer to it as flag leaf or boot stage of production. But again, it's really when that last leaf comes out of the top of that annual ryegrass before that seed head begins to emerge and starts to become too mature. So what about wilt time? If we go back, this is a question that we often get about how long do I need to let that forage wilt in the field before I bale and wrap the forage for storage later. And so this is one that largely depends on field conditions as well as weather conditions. And sometimes we hear, well, we can make baleage in a day. Well, that might be true on some days where we have especially good drying conditions. But for things like annual ryegrass, if it's a little bit wet out when we go to cut that forage, that can change the time that we need to let that forage wilt in the field before we would bale and wrap it. Okay, so this is a very good study that was conducted at LSU where they compared different forage types and they looked at, on average, what would be the expected wilt time for those forages under good drying conditions. Okay, and so we can see that it ranges, but for our cool season forages, it's actually a little bit longer wilt time than what we would expect for our warm season forages. So that's to be expected given that in the summer months we would have much hotter conditions, so that would reduce that wilt time or drying time in the field. But the range can be fairly expansive, and so again, I think it's important to have some ways that we can measure forage moisture in the field after cutting to really monitor where we are to make sure we're hitting our target. So the best way to do that is to conduct what we would call a microwave test. And there are several publications that are available on the internet that reference this particular method, how you would do that. But essentially you would go into the field, get a representative forage sample, cut that into small pieces, and put it on a paper plate of known weight, and you would microwave that down to a constant weight. And so by doing that, we would be able to determine the overall moisture percentage of that forage and better get a sense of when we would be able to bale and wrap. So those publications are available online. Really the easiest way would be just to go to a search engine and type in forage microwave test, and it would pull up one of those publications as a reference material. So paying attention to wilt time is very critical, and this is something that influences the overall moisture level of that baleage and ultimately how well that forage is going to be stored for later use. So it's critical that we do remain in that target, like we said, of the 40 to 60% moisture range. And you can see that really that's where we would expect to have the best fermentation characteristics. If we're much over that, then we get into danger of that forage basically souring or getting into a risk for potential botulism toxin occurring at those high levels of moisture, mainly due to spoilage of that forage during the storage process. Now, if we get down into these very low moisture ranges, so not quite low enough to where we're making hay, but we're not really making true baleage either, then we get the forage too dry to have desirable fermentation characteristics. Okay, so there is the line of where we want to stay within that overall moisture range for what is to be expected, and it relates to the stability of that forage at the time of feeding. So after we have baled and wrapped that forage, what are some expectations that we can get from baleage? And, you know, is baleage really better than hay? Okay, so that's oftentimes a question that we get. And I think that baleage can be better than dry hay, but if we're putting up very high quality hay, then oftentimes it might not be that different in terms of the expected animal performance that we might see in that system. And so this is an example of that. This is a study that we conducted at our E.B. Smith Research Center in Central Alabama. And it was a preconditioning study where we were looking at feeding calves different types of conserved forages during a 45-day period with supplementation at basically about 1% of their body weight per day of a 50-50 mixture of soy hulls and corn gluten feed. And so we saw in that system that a ryegrass baleage that was cut really more in the boot to almost seed head stage. We had very high quality of that forage product, but if we look at some of our other conserved forage systems, we have very high quality hay that we were feeding in this system as well. So if we compared across each of those systems, they were all very comparable in terms of the overall gain that we saw in that system. So getting a higher quality product for baleage relative to your quality of hay that you produce or purchase is going to be an important decision as to whether or not baleage is really going to provide an advantage in your particular production setting. If we look at summer annuals, this is another type of forage crop that we wanted to look at in terms of baleage production quality relative to hay. And again, this is a study that was conducted with cow-calf pairs during a winter feeding trial where we fed these different forages for 60 days. And overall, all of these were very high quality forage products. So we saw in terms of their animal performance that the cattle were able to maintain good body condition score on all of these forage systems alone. And this was being fed to the cattle during peak lactation. So although there was some slight change in terms of their body condition, all in all, the cows maintained very good condition in this system. One thing that was observed with the summer annuals in this system is that we did kind of pick up some soil contamination whenever we harvested those summer annuals. And so that was reflected here by this ash value in terms of basically showing that we were getting some soil contamination based on harvesting that baleage rather than harvesting for hay production. And so we've already talked a little bit about these animal performance characteristics, but I think this is important data to show that baleage can be an alternative to dry hay, and that forage quality among all of these products is going to be very important and the driving factor that determines what we see here in terms of animals being able to maintain body condition. If we look at the overall economics of these systems and compare them, overall our baleage production systems, particularly as it relates to making annuals into baleage, is going to have a higher cost per ton than hay production. Okay, and so there is some extra labor that goes into the baleage production process. We also have additional equipment and supplies that go into that, and the cost of using an annual in that system relative to having a perennial. Okay, so the overall cost of production was slightly greater for the annual systems relative to the hay production system. Now, if we look at baleage production from warm season perennials, this is some work that was conducted at the University of Florida. And so this is just an example of really how many cuttings of that baleage would I expect to get, and could I use my hay and baleage production system interchangeably. And I think this example is a good reflection of how we might consider using the baleage not only for our annuals, but also being able to use it on our perennials during the summer months, particularly with Bermuda grass and Bahia grass. So in this study, they were looking at comparing whether or not they were just going to make hay throughout the summer months, or based on the expected weather conditions that they were going to have during the summer. If the weather looked like they weren't going to have really a good 3-day window without rain, then they would make the decision to make baleage in the pasture system instead of making hay. So they compared those two systems as to whether or not they just made straight hay throughout the summer, or whether they did a hay and baleage system interchangeably. And they were able to get more cuttings whenever they decided to wrap some of the cuttings for baleage rather than waiting for a window for hay production. And subsequently, they had greater total yield out of that system because they were able to get more cuttings during the year. Also, if we look at the overall quality differences of that, by being able to harvest on a more timely basis, they observed that the overall quality that they got out of the forage, whether it was hay or baleage in that system, was greater whenever they were making Bermuda grass, hay or baleage in that system. So what does this mean, and what are some tips and learning experiences then that we've gotten from the studies that we've conducted, as well as just kind of going through and reading experiences that others have had working with baleage production systems? And so I think one of the first keys to think about is to remember not to cut down any more than you can handle. So really, we're trying to only cut down what we think we can bale and wrap in a single day time period. And this gets to be a real challenge, especially with things like annual ryegrass, because once it's ready to go. And a lot of times it's all ready at once. And so trying to kind of space that out so we don't tackle everything at once and then we're overwhelmed trying to get everything baled and wrapped at once is something that is a challenge, but we want to try to space out over a period of a couple of days if possible. Also, we need to reduce our bale size compared to if we're making conventional hay. And so a popular size for baleage, and one that's not an overwhelming size, is generally a 4x5 roll. And the reason for this is because whenever we make baleage, we have to remember that we're adding in a lot of extra water weight to that. And so if we make a larger bale than this and we go to pick it up or move it later on, especially if it's individually wrapped rolls, then that changes sometimes the equipment that we need to do that with, and can make it a lot more challenging to move around. Also, when you go to open that baleage and you go to feed it, if you're using like a traditional bale spear, I know I've seen some spears that have been bent from the bale just simply being so heavy due to that extra moisture weight. So trying to adjust that bale size down, I think, is important just from a logistical standpoint. Also, whenever we go to bale that hay prior to wrapping, we want to make sure that we're using plastic twine or net wrap to do that. because some of our other types of twine may begin to degrade actually during that storage process after it's been wrapped with plastic. Also, in terms of forage sampling, what are some things that we can do? You know, all of the examples that we've provided have quality information with them, and quality is really what we're trying to get at, whether we're making hay or baleage. But if we are trying to go out and take a forage sample on baleage, it can be a bit more challenging than if we're sampling dry hay bales. And so you need a little bit of extra power to be able to do this. And I know this is something that we've experienced just with going out and trying to sample for research studies, is that if we're using a hay probe, specifically a Penn State hay probe and a drill, make sure you're using a corded drill for extra power. It makes the sampling process a lot easier than if you're out there with a battery powered drill and you're burning through batteries left and right, trying to core into that really dense material. Also, if we're making individually wrapped bales, whenever we get to the storage process, that's another important key. And a good tip on that is to store on the end of those bales in a well-drained area. So the reason we look at storing on the ends of those bales is because that's where we have the most overlap in terms of our plastic wrap. So if we're storing those outside on the ground, that's going to give us the best layer of protection between the bale and the soil from really wicking up any moisture or starting to degrade that plastic material over time. So feeding considerations for using baleage efficiently. What are some things that we can think about? Oftentimes people want to know, how should I feed this baleage? How do I know that the baleage is good quality when I unwrap it? And so we've talked about forage testing and the importance of that. But when we actually go to physically open that baleage at the time of feeding, we can also really just do a visual and smell test to make sure that that is quality product that we're about to feed our livestock. So suitable baleage has several characteristics. One of those is that it's going to have a characteristic acidic or bread-like smell. So it should almost smell a little bit sweet, and it will have a very distinct fermented smell to it. But the bale should also be free from excessive amounts of mold. Some mold is going to be expected, especially on the edges or kind of the rounded part of the bale where the plastic is meeting. We often see that we'll get a layer on the outside of the bale, but it shouldn't be completely covered in mold. And it should have a greenish brown color to it. Basically, it should look very similar to the day that you wrapped it. It shouldn't have changed or started to degrade a whole lot from that time of wrapping. And we want to make sure that that's free from manure contamination. Okay, so that's especially an important consideration if maybe we were making baleage on a field that we had grazed at one part during the season. So a dual use field and not just exclusively a field that we would use for conserved forage production. And then also it should be barely damp to the touch. So if we pull out some of that forage from the bale and really take it and wring it in our hands, there shouldn't be excess moisture coming from the forage during that process. It should feel damp, it should feel moist to the touch, but we shouldn't be able to wring water out of it if we were to take that forage and wring it in our hands. So undesirable characteristics are that really it's just going to smell rotten, have a very distinct pungent smell to it. We would probably see excessive amounts of mold, or the bale would have visually started to degrade and lose shape, lose form, whether it's in a tube wrap or whether we're talking about individually wrapped bales. And we're going to note that it's going to have a very strong color to it, maybe very dark in color. So some of the bales that I've seen were really almost black in color from that oxygen exposure that caused them to start to degrade over time. In terms of feeding practices, after we've opened baleage and we're getting ready to provide it to our livestock, we've talked about forage analysis. I know I've harped on that a couple of times, but it's especially critical when we get to the feeding phase that we have that analysis so we know whether or not the forage alone or whether supplement is going to be required to help achieve our production goals at the time of use. Whenever we're feeding this forage, we want to make sure we're feeding it on a dry matter basis. And so a lot of times we hear people say that, well, they'll clean the baleage up a lot faster than our hay. And that's true. They do tend to have a preference, it seems, to go to ensiled forage over a dry forage. However, sometimes I think whenever we hear that statement, it's because maybe we're not allocating them enough of that baleage to meet their overall dry matter needs. So remember that on average, a mature cow is going to consume between 2 to 2.5% of her body weight per day in dry matter. So if we're feeding baleage, remember that it's really only about half of that bale that you're feeding is dry matter. Okay, so it may mean that we have to feed more baleage bales than we would actually dry hay bales to get to the same amount of dry matter in that animal's diet per day. Also, we want to make sure that we're feeding that baleage out within a 3-day window after opening. So when I say feeding it out, I mean that the bales that we allocate to our cattle on the first day, we want to make sure that same bale is gone within a 3-day time period. And the reason for that is because as those bales are exposed to oxygen, they will start to degrade fairly rapidly. And these are some results from a trial that we did looking at some different forage inoculants on baleage, but we measured the bale temperature after opening and during feeding of that bale and observed that really after kind of that 2-day time period, the bale temperature starts to increase drastically, and it means that that bale is starting to go through a heat and really starting to degrade in quality at that time point. So finally, what are some technologies and buzzwords associated with baleage production that you might be hearing as you open up popular press articles and are reading through those? These are some key terms that you might see relative to baleage production. One of those being inoculants. Forage inoculants are used generally to increase the overall stability of the baleage during the storage process, and also really to help with stability of that product during feed out. And so this is something that has been widely used in terms of silage production, but now we're trying to adapt those silage products into our baleage production systems. And so there's been a lot of extensive testing going on at universities in the Southeast, looking at several commercial products in terms of their viability to improve the aerobic stability, especially of baleage in the region. BMR technology is not a new technology, but it is something that is talked about a lot more when it comes to conserved forage production, whether it's for hay, baleage, or silage production. And basically, BMR technology, or brown midrib, is a characteristic or a trait that some forages have that means that those forages naturally have been selected for lower concentrations of lignin, which essentially means that they have overall greater digestibility. And so this is a technology that's increasingly being used, especially in summer annuals. And so you may see more and more of these products on the market, but that may be a desirable fit for a baleage production system, mainly because it's helping with overall forage digestibility of that product and helping us attain a better quality product. Finally, wrappers. There's been a lot of change in terms of the types of wrappers that are available on the market, and we're starting to see more and more of those being offered at our commercial farm dealerships in the region. And so there are inline wrappers as well as individual bale wrappers. And so there's a lot of discussion and a lot of resources out there in terms of which one might be a better fit for your operation. And so I'd encourage you to go and look at some of those publications on which one might be the best fit if you're considering this as a technology for use in your operation. So next I wanted to shift gears and talk more about silage production in the Southeast. What are some challenges that we experience with producing quality silage? And again, what are some tips and even some technologies that we're seeing with technology, or that we're seeing with silage production? So silage defined, silage is a high moisture forage crop, or one that has been harvested chopped and packed into an airtight storage facility. So traditionally, we might think of silage in large silos, especially in the northern U.S. That's something that we see or have seen traditionally a lot. But the way that we store silage in the Southeast might be a bit different or has changed from that kind of silo approach to more being stored in bunks or even these large silo bags that are shown here in the picture. So silage is a product that we're typically going to harvest between 65 to 70% moisture as our target of where we want that product to be prior to this ensiling process. So what are some technologies specifically with corn silage? Corn silage would be the silage product that's probably most widely used in our region, followed by sorghum silage production. And I think that there's quite a few different technologies on the market, but that some that you might have seen are that most of our corn silage varieties are going to come with some quote unquote stack technologies, which essentially are technologies that are bred into those products to allow them to better produce a high quality, high yielding product for silage production. So some of those technologies might be things like Roundup Ready traits, as well as Stay Green, or basically trying to encourage high yield and high leaf material associated with those silage varieties. VMR technology is also something that's used in terms of silage production, where again, the key is that we're trying to select for traits in some of these forages and silage crops that have greater digestibility. Inoculant use is a lot more widely used in terms of silage production, but again, some of the key inoculants with proven technology are ones that are specifically working towards better aerobic stability in terms of those products. And so if you're looking for some of those, there's a lot of good publications out there that discuss what are the desirable types of bacteria that we're looking for to promote good ensiling using those inoculants. In terms of sorghum silage, which would be really the next, probably most adopted use of silage production in the region, whenever we're going out to select a sorghum variety for silage production, we have to make sure we understand the difference between the forage type sorghums and grain type sorghums that are available on the market. So our forage type sorghums are going to be the ones that are more widely used for actual sorghum silage production. And so those are going to be ones that are generally taller growing, and they tend to have nutritive value somewhat less to corn, but very similar in terms of their overall actual dry matter yield. Grain types are going to generally be shorter in terms of their overall production height, and they've been specifically selected for the energy of their growth to go towards that reproductive phase and to produce high grain yields associated with them. So these are going to have nutritive value maybe more comparable to corn silage, but the emphasis on those is specifically more towards grain production and less towards general forage dry matter production. Sorghum sudangrass is another option for silage production, and it may have more comparable yields to corn silage, but it's generally better suited for situations where we have less productive ground or where corn might not be as successful. So that's a reason that we see maybe more use of sorghum sudangrass as a potential silage crop as well. It also has desirable characteristics from the standpoint that it has potential for harvest up to 2 times per season, and it can be a good fit into a double cropping type system where maybe we have some winter crops that we're using. We can come in after that with something like sorghum sudangrass, and it's a short enough season crop that we can potentially get 2 harvests off of that land area. So tips for making high quality silage. In terms of questions received about silage production, this really goes through and highlights kind of what are some of the key areas that we often get asked about the most for that. One of those would be hybrid selection or variety selection for having high agronomic yields as well as the nutritional traits that we would like to be able to make a high quality forage product for livestock. And so a good resource for going through and selecting those is going to be to look at the University of Georgia as well as the University of Florida's variety trials that they typically do with corn silage on an annual basis. They have an annual field day that rotates back and forth between the two states that highlights some of the varieties that do very well in our production environment. Also making sure whenever we select those varieties that we know how long of season production that they're going to provide us. That's going to allow us to then better target when we think we're going to harvest those forages for silage production. So the way to know that we're getting close to harvesting forages for silage, particularly if we're talking about corn silage, that's traditionally been done using the milk line approach. However, a second way to know that we're hitting that right target in terms of our moisture content is going to be to conduct a forage moisture analysis. And we talked about for baleage production using the microwave test as an option. There are also specific silage moisture testers that are available on the market that we can use if this is something that we're doing on an annual basis. I think this could be a really good investment for use in that system. So again, if you're looking to purchase one of those moisture testers, really the easiest way is just to go to Google, type in silage moisture tester, and many of these products pop up for purchase and use on your individual farm. In terms of harvesting and processing that silage, there's a balance here. This is a critical step in terms of making high quality silage because it determines the quality of the product and the effective fiber size of that silage that will be used ultimately either in dairy diets, beef diets, in our southeastern systems. So we want to get a balance really between that chop length size on our corn silage because it's important, one, from the livestock perspective for effective fiber, but then also two, in terms of when we go to compact that silage and preserve it for the storage process, it influences how dense we can make that pack during the ensiling process. For inoculants and additives, these are again another area that is important for consideration for making high quality silage in the Southeast. Obviously, our warm environmental conditions are a challenge, and so reducing that exposure to air and anything that we can do to improve the aerobic stability of that product and enhance microbial fermentation to create good acid formation in that product for storage is going to help us have a product that can be stored better for a longer period of time. So looking into inoculant use and additives is something that I think is especially important in terms of corn silage as well as sorghum silage storage in our region. So the most successes have been seen with heterolactic inoculants such as the Buchneri type products, and these can improve overall aerobic stability. So combo inoculants, or ones that have both homolactic and heterolactic fermentation characteristics, are ones that have had a bit more variable types of results. And so I'd encourage you, if you're thinking about purchasing some of these inoculants, to really visit with the company as well as look for research that's been conducted on those products to determine whether or not they're going to provide a savings for you in terms of their dry matter preservation characteristics. Also, if we look at packing and sealing this product, this is really kind of that final critical step to, once we've gone through growing, harvesting, chopping, adding inoculants to that product, now this is really that final step that we need for the storage process. And so packing and sealing is important to get as much air out of the product as possible. And in general, we're going to target 14 pounds of dry matter per cubic foot, whether it's in this bunk situation or we're looking at a bag. We're trying to get it as tight as possible to be able to store that product for later use. After the storage process, if we're looking at actually feeding the product, what are some tips and rules that we want to follow whenever we're using that? We know that our silage products, one of the key characteristics and most desirable characteristics of those is that they tend to be high in energy and digestibility. However, specifically when we're talking about corn silage, oftentimes protein may be a limiting nutrient depending on how we're using that. So especially that's going to be the case in terms of dairy production diets and TMRs, but also from a beef management standpoint, if we're using these silage products maybe for something like backgrounding calves, protein consumption or supplementation is going to be important. And so this figure really illustrates that concept a little bit better, and it notes that there's a relationship between the overall forage crude protein concentration and the expected dry matter consumption that we might observe in terms of silage and in terms of making that product be something that provides good animal performance in our system. So if we look, there's really a break point at about 7% crude protein, where if we have less than 7% crude protein in that animal's diet, then we get a hit in terms of expected forage dry matter intake. And so if we have some protein supplementation to go along with that, we can get back up to a more desirable level of forage dry matter intake in that animal's diet, which can ultimately lead to us being able to better achieve our animal performance goals. So in order to do this, there is an acclimation phase oftentimes associated with feeding animals silage-based products, especially calves. They're going to take some time to get used to kind of the touch and feel of that product, so to speak, in their diet. And so we have to have a time period where we're allowing those animals to acclimate to get up to kind of this desirable level of forage dry matter intake. And it may take a couple of weeks, especially in the case of calves, to get them up to where we would want them to be consuming. For cows, and specifically, this is an example for beef cattle and the use of corn silage and sorghum silage in that system. Silage is an excellent product to feed cows, but again, in this case, we might actually be overfeeding some of their energy requirements in that system. And so corn silage, rather than just giving it to them free choice, kind of as their roughage of choice during the winter months, I could see a very effective use of that corn silage being to kind of back that down to a limit feeding situation where a certain percentage of what we're feeding them is corn silage, and then we're also providing maybe another lower quality roughage to meet dry matter requirements. So that would be something like, you know, providing maybe a free choice round bale of hay out there in the system while giving them a daily allocation of corn silage to meet their energy demands, rather than meeting all of their dry matter requirements from corn silage alone. So in review, we've talked about a lot of different aspects as it relates to baleage and silage production. And really what I wanted to do today is provide kind of more of an overview of those systems. And there's a lot of aspects of this that we could go into a lot more detail, but I wanted to reference you to some of that additional information at the end of this presentation. But really our goal today is just to talk about baleage and silage production, how those technologies have changed over time, and kind of what were the trends that we're seeing in the region in terms of their overall use in terms of animal diets. But overall, our goal at the end of the day is to produce a high quality forage product. And so certainly we can do that with baleage or silage production, but the key is to have timely harvest, to pay attention to the moisture levels of that forage, and then to process that forage effectively for the storage time period prior to feeding. So if you would like more information about baleage production or silage production in Alabama, we have a couple of different resources for you available on our website listed here, alabamabeefsystems.com. And these specifically talk about the use of these products in beef cattle diets and what are some ways that we can use that effectively, some of those feeding strategies more specifically, if you would like to look up that additional information after today's webinar. So again, this month is Forage Month, and in celebration of forages, we wanted to make you aware of some of our additional resources related to our Forage Focus program. We have monthly updates via e-newsletter, as well as publications and upcoming events that are located on our website at alabamaforages.com. So this would be our website where you can get the most up-to-date information on any type of work that we're doing related to forage production in the state. And I would encourage you to visit that website periodically for additional information.